The retired military canine hit the emergency doors like a freight train with fur and teeth, all 90 pounds of him. And the reinforced leash in Sergeant Dale Hawkins' grip burned a raw stripe across his palm before he even cleared the threshold. The dog wasn't barking. That was the part nobody in the waiting room understood. He was silent, coiled, trembling with something that had nothing to do with fear. And every doctor and orderly in the intake bay took one look at those pale yellow eyes and backed against the wall. Every doctor except one. Emily Carr stepped forward from the back of the room, quiet, unhurried, the way someone moves when they already know the outcome. And the dog stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. His nose dropped. His shoulders released. And he pressed his massive head directly into her open hand like a child coming home. The sergeant stared. The doctors stared. Nobody in that room could explain what they had just seen. Nobody except Emily. And she wasn't saying a word. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is exactly the kind we tell on this channel. The ones about people who were written off, pushed out, and quietly proven right in the most devastating way possible. Like this video, drop a comment and tell me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far these stories are traveling. Now, let's get into it. Harlow Falls. Montana was not the kind of town that made headlines. It had one traffic light, two diners, a pharmacy that doubled as a gift shop, and Crestview Valley Medical Center, a regional hospital that served roughly 40,000 people spread across 4 counties of high desert and cattle land. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, where the same families had worked the same jobs for 3 generations, and where a stranger who showed up without a story quickly became the subject of one. Emily Carr had been at Crestview for 2 years. In that time, she had become fluent in a particular kind of invisibility. She was 38, no family in the area, no explanation for why she'd landed here specifically, in this particular zip code in the middle of nowhere, Montana, when her nursing credentials were good enough to place her at any major metropolitan hospital in the country. She rented a small house on the edge of town, drove a 10-year-old truck, and kept to herself in the particular way that made people decide she was either dull or hiding something. The staff had landed on a comfortable middle ground. She was competent but forgettable. A reliable body to put on the floor when they needed coverage. The kind of person you scheduled for night shifts and holidays because she never complained. Dr. Vanessa Pryor, the hospital's chief of medicine and the kind of administrator who had never once questioned whether her own instincts might be wrong, had formed her opinion of Emily Carr in the first week and never revisited it. Pryor was 61, silver-haired, and had built Crestview's reputation on a brand of institutional confidence that looked a lot like certainty and functioned a lot like arrogance. She had recruited physicians from Billings and Missoula. She had modernized the radiology wing. She had, in her own words on more than one occasion, elevated this hospital above what anyone had a right to expect from a facility its size. What she had not done was pay attention to the quiet nurse who worked the overnight trauma rotation, and occasionally, very quietly, caught things other people missed. 3 months ago, Emily had flagged an intake patient whose presenting symptoms pointed to appendicitis, but whose chart pattern, she noted on the handover document, was more consistent with mesenteric ischemia. The attending physician, Dr. Carl Briggs, 35, fast-talking, perpetually convinced he was the smartest person in any given room, had overridden the note without comment. 6 hours later, the patient went into crisis and required emergency vascular surgery. Nobody formally connected the dots. Emily didn't push it. She just wrote it down in the small notebook she kept in her locker, the way she kept track of everything, and moved on. 2 months ago, she had recommended a specific medication adjustment for a post-op patient whose recovery was stalling in a way that didn't match the official diagnosis. The supervising nurse, a woman named Patrice Weld, who had worked at Crestview for 18 years and had a territorial attitude toward newer staff that she wore like a badge of honor, had told Emily to stay in her lane and document only what was assigned to her. The patient's recovery turned around within 48 hours of an attending finally making the exact adjustment Emily had suggested. Nobody said anything about that either. This was the texture of Emily Carr's professional life. She existed at Crestview the way a load-bearing wall exists in a house, essential to the structure, completely unacknowledged, and the subject of serious complaint only when someone wanted to knock it down. She was working a Wednesday afternoon shift when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice over the emergency radio was clipped and unusual enough to pull 3 nurses to the intake desk at once. A military transport was inbound, retired Special Operations K9, male, approximately 9 years old, presenting with severe mobility distress and acute behavioral instability. Handler present and on-site. ETA, 4 minutes. "Why are they bringing a dog here?" Patrice Weld said, already annoyed. "We're not a veterinary facility." "Nearest animal hospital that can handle a dog his size and condition is in Billings," said the dispatcher, still audible. "Handler says the dog can't make the 4-hour drive." "That is not our problem." Emily had already turned toward the supply corridor to pull a triage cart. "Emily." Patrice's voice had the specific flatness she reserved for correction. "I said that is not our problem." "I heard you." Emily kept moving. "I'm going to have supplies ready anyway." She heard Patrice say something to someone else behind her, something with the word attitude in it, and kept walking. She had the cart positioned near the emergency bay doors when the military transport pulled into the ambulance lane. The vehicle was a dark green SUV with government plates, and it came in fast, braking hard. Before it fully stopped, the passenger door opened and Sergeant Dale Hawkins half fell out of it with a leash wrapped twice around his forearm and a dog at the other end of it who was not, under any reading of the word, stable. Titan was a Belgian Malinois, the breed that special operations units had used for decades because of their speed, their intelligence, and their capacity for exactly the kind of controlled violence that made them effective in combat. I was 92 pounds of muscle, scar tissue, and something that looked from a distance like aggression, but was, to a trained eye, something else. He wasn't attacking, he was reacting. There was a difference that mattered enormously, and Emily saw it immediately. Sergeant Hawkins was a big man, broad through the shoulders, and he was struggling. The dog wasn't trying to bite him. He was pulling toward the doors, toward the building, toward the smell of antiseptic and medication, in a way that suggested he knew, on some animal level, that this was where help was. The emergency bay staff scattered. A resident named Marcus Dole actually pressed himself against a supply cabinet. Dr. Briggs, who had followed the commotion out of curiosity, took one look at the dog and said loudly, "Someone call animal control." "Stand back," Hawkins said. His voice was tight and exhausted in the way of a man who had been managing an impossible situation for too long. "He's not dangerous. He's in pain. Just give him space." "Sir, we are not equipped," Briggs started. "I know what you're equipped for. I need someone to look at my dog." Emily was already moving. She moved without announcing herself, without asking permission, without the kind of performative calm that people put on when they're scared and trying not to show it. She just walked forward, steady, deliberate, arms relaxed at her sides, and crouched down about 6 feet from the dog, not looking at him directly, angling her body slightly away, letting him decide. Titan stopped pulling. His head turned toward her. His ears, which had been flat and back, came forward. He sniffed the air. And then, in a moment that stopped everyone in the bay into complete stillness, he walked toward her, pressed his nose into her palm, and stood there, breathing. Hawkins's mouth was open. "How did you—" He stopped. Started again. "He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that with anyone, not since he came back." Emily ran one hand along the dog's flank, slow and methodical. Her face was neutral, professional, but her jaw had tightened slightly at something, and she was looking at the animal's left hindquarter with an intensity that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with assessment. "How long has he been walking like this?" she asked. 6, 7 months. Hawkins crouched to the dog's level out of habit, keeping his voice low. The military vets kept clearing him, said it was soft tissue, muscle strain from service, gave him anti-inflammatories and told me to limit his activity. And it didn't improve. It got worse, but every time I pushed, they said the imaging looked fine, that I was— He paused. The pause carried weight. They said I was being overprotective, that I was anthropomorphizing, that he was a working animal, and I needed to let the medical professionals handle his medical care. Emily's hand had stopped moving. She was palpating a specific point along the hip joint, gentle but precise, and the dog, who had held himself rigid through everything, let out one short, involuntary sound and shifted his weight. "I need to get him into imaging," she said. "You're a human hospital," Briggs said from behind her. "The equipment is the same." She stood without hurrying. The anatomy is different. The physics isn't. Emily. Dr. Pryor had appeared in the doorway between the bay and the main corridor. She had the tone of someone who had been briefed on the situation and arrived already having decided. This is not an appropriate use of hospital resources. I know. Then, I'm requesting an exception. Emily turned to face Pryor directly. This, in itself, was unusual enough to create a small shift in the room's atmosphere. Emily Carr did not typically look administrators in the eye with that kind of steadiness. 5 minutes of imaging time. I'll cover the cost from my own paycheck if the billing is a problem. That's not... He has a fracture. Emily said it plainly, without emphasis, without drama, like stating a weather condition. Not a muscle strain, a fracture. And if I'm right, he's been living with it for 6 months while your colleagues in military veterinary medicine kept clearing him for duty. I'd like to confirm it before we talk about whether it's worth the resources. The room was very quiet. Pryor looked at her for a long moment. You're a nurse, Pryor said. Not a veterinarian, not a physician. I know what I am. Emily's voice didn't change. I'm asking for 5 minutes. Pryor made a sound that wasn't quite a word and turned away, which was not a yes, but was also not a no. And Emily took it as what it was, a gap she could move through. She moved through it. Hawkins followed with Titan, and the dog moved with her the way animals move with people they've decided to trust, which is entirely and without reservation. The imaging corridor was quiet at this hour. Emily pulled the K9 imaging protocols she'd looked up twice in the last 2 years, not because she'd expected a situation like this, but because that was simply how her mind worked, cataloging information against future contingency, and positioned Titan with Hawkins's help on the table. The dog was calm in a way that was almost eerie. He watched Emily's face throughout the process. The images loaded onto the screen 14 minutes later. Hawkins was standing beside her when she pulled them up, and she heard the specific silence that falls over a person when they're looking at something that rewrites a narrative they've been told for months. That's his hip, Emily said. She touched the edge of the screen, tracing the fault line. This is a fracture. Probably stress fracture initially, the kind that doesn't show on surface X-ray without specific angulation and contrast. It's been progressing for months. See the remodeling here and here. This is long-term bone response to unaddressed trauma. Hawkins sat down. Not pulled up a chair. Sat down, heavily, on the floor next to the imaging table, one hand on Titan's shoulder. How did they miss this? His voice was rougher than before. 6 months. 6 months of imaging, and they said, They may not have missed it, Emily said. Hawkins looked up. What do you know about Operation Iron Shield? She asked. The name landed in the room like a stone into still water. She watched the ripples move across his face. Recognition, then something colder. Where did you hear that name? It's on Titan's intake file, Emily said. Under previous assignment history. It's a reference I wasn't supposed to notice, probably. But I noticed things. Hawkins was on his feet again. His entire posture had changed. Who are you? I'm a nurse at a regional hospital in Harlow Falls, Montana. She said it without inflection. That's all I am right now. That's not... He stopped himself, recalibrated. That name, that program. It was decommissioned 14 years ago, officially. I was a junior handler during the last phase. There were questions about the medical clearances, about the dogs being sent back into service before they were ready. There were reports filed. Nothing ever came of it. I know, Emily said. I filed one of them. The hallway outside the imaging room was glass-walled on one side, and Emily saw, before Hawkins fully processed what she'd just told him, the shapes moving past it. 3 people. Dark clothing. The specific posture of federal authority. They stopped at the door. The one in front, a woman, 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled straight back, wearing the kind of neutral expression that cost years of training, looked through the glass directly at Emily and did not look surprised to find her. She knocked twice. Emily opened the door. Emily Carr? The woman said. Yes. Special Agent Diane Hollowell, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. She showed credentials. We've been looking for you for about 3 weeks. We got ahead of your location from a tip when this dog's transfer request flagged a file we've been watching for 14 years. Behind Hollowell, in the corridor, Emily could see more movement. Hospital staff. Patrice Weld with her arms crossed and her face tight with the expression of someone who was recalibrating everything she thought she knew. Dr. Briggs with his hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable. And at the far end of the hall, Dr. Vanessa Pryor, who had managed institutions and controlled narratives and kept this hospital exactly where she decided it should be for over a decade, standing very still, watching a federal investigator treat the hospital's most dismissible nurse like someone whose location had been worth 3 weeks of active pursuit. "You should come in," Emily said. She stepped back and held the door. Titan, still on the imaging table behind her, lifted his head and watched the federal agents enter without alarm, the way an animal watches people arrive who belong in the same story he does. Agent Hollowell didn't sit down. None of the 3 investigators did. They stood in the imaging room with the particular stillness of people who had learned long ago that sitting made witnesses nervous in unproductive ways, and Hollowell specifically had the quality of someone who had conducted enough interviews in enough uncomfortable rooms to know exactly how much space to leave before the other person filled it. Emily filled none of it. She stood beside the imaging screen with her arms loose at her sides and waited, and the silence between them had a specific texture, not uncomfortable, not hostile, but measured, like 2 people who understood that what happened next mattered and were each deciding how much to reveal before the other one moved. 14 years is a long time to hold on to documents, Hollowell finally said. Yes. Most people who file reports and get buried don't keep copies. I'm not most people. Hollowell looked at her for a moment. Not the kind of look that assessed or challenged, more the kind that confirmed something already suspected. No, she said. You're not. She glanced at the imaging screen at the fracture line Emily had traced. He's been walking on that for 6 months. Minimum. Could be longer depending on when the initial stress fracture occurred. The remodeling pattern suggests the injury predates his last deployment by at least 3 months. Hawkins, who had been standing with one hand on Titan's back, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Sergeant, Hollowell said without looking at him, we're going to need a full statement from you separately. Everything that happened at Fort Delacroix, the clearance approvals, the names of the veterinary officers who signed off, the timeline. I've given statements. You've given statements to people inside the structure we're currently investigating. That's different. She turned back to Emily. We need the documents. I know you do. Are they accessible? Emily looked at the imaging screen for a moment. At the fracture. At the evidence of 6 months of pain that had been looked at, assessed, and deliberately misread by people with the credentials and the authority to make that misreading stick. They're accessible, she said. But I need to understand what happens next. Not generally, specifically. That's fair. Because the last time I handed documentation to the right people, I lost my career, my rank, my clearance, and 3 years of my life to a legal process that was designed to exhaust me into dropping it. Emily's voice stayed level. This was not anger, or not only anger. It was the particular calm of someone who had already processed the worst of something and was now operating from the far side of it. So I need to understand what's different this time. Hollowell nodded once, slowly. What's different is that we already have corroborating evidence from a separate investigation that we can't proceed on without the foundational documentation you're describing. Your files aren't the only evidence. They're the key that unlocks evidence we already have. That changes the legal position considerably. And my record? Correction is part of what we're seeking, yes. The room held that for a moment. Titan shifted on the imaging table and made a low sound, and Emily turned back to him without thinking, ran one hand along his shoulder, and the dog settled. It was automatic, muscle memory. The kind of gesture that people develop through years of specific practice, not an afternoon of goodwill. The second investigator, younger, a man named Reyes, who had been quiet until now, was watching her hands with the careful attention of someone filing observations for later. She noticed him noticing. She didn't change anything. He needs surgery, Emily said. Before anything else, before any of the rest of this, Titan needs a surgical team. The fracture is unstable. Every hour he's walking on it increases the risk of full displacement. We have a veterinary surgical team on standby in Billings. Billings is 4 hours. Can they get here? Hollowell looked at Reyes. Something passed between them, a rapid administrative calculation. We can have them here in 2 hours by transport. Then do that. Emily moved toward the door. I'll be back in 20 minutes. I need to make arrangements for a room we can use. Ms. Carr, she was already in the corridor. What she encountered in the corridor was Dr. Vanessa Pryor. Pryor had positioned herself in the hallway with the specific body language of an administrator who had decided to assert control over a situation that had visibly slipped past her, and she had the expression of someone running several calculations simultaneously. The federal investigators, the dog, the nurse she'd spent 2 years treating as a staffing unit, and what all of it added up to. Emily. Her voice was careful in a way it had never been careful before. I think we should talk. I have to arrange a surgical suite. We don't perform veterinary surgery in this hospital. We have a room with the equipment a surgical team will need, and I've been told a licensed veterinary team is en route. All I need is space. Emily kept moving. If it's a liability issue, I'll get Agent Hollowell to make the formal request. It's not, Emily. Pryor kept pace with her, which was notable because Pryor didn't typically pace other people. She stopped people. She redirected them. She didn't follow them down corridors. Those agents. What is this about? Emily stopped. She turned and looked at Pryor with an expression that was entirely professional and entirely empty of the deference that had characterized every interaction they'd had for 2 years. It wasn't hostility. It was something more unsettling to someone like Pryor. It was neutrality. The neutrality of someone who had simply stopped performing the expected role. A military working dog with an undiagnosed fracture is going to have corrective surgery in this hospital this evening, Emily said. That surgery is connected to a federal investigation into fraudulent medical clearances that harmed multiple service animals over a period of years. I am a material witness in that investigation. I would appreciate your support in making the surgical arrangement possible, and I would also appreciate it if we could have the other conversation, whatever conversation you're actually trying to have, after the dog is out of surgery. Pryor stared at her. You're a material witness, she repeated. Yes. In a federal... Yes. A long pause. Which room do you need? Pryor said. Emily told her and walked away, and behind her she could hear Pryor on her phone, her voice reduced to the quieter, more careful register of someone who had just realized they didn't have all the information they thought they had. The next 2 hours had the specific quality of controlled chaos that Emily had always been able to move through better than most people. Not because she was unaffected by it, but because she had a particular ability to identify the essential thread in a tangle and pull it rather than addressing the tangle wholesale. The veterinary surgical team arrived from Billings in a military transport at 6:47 in the evening, 43 minutes ahead of the estimated window. There were 3 of them. A veterinary surgeon named Dr. Lena Grasso, who moved like she'd been in field conditions before and expected them again, and 2 technicians who unpacked their equipment with the efficiency of people who did not waste motion. Emily briefed Grasso on the imaging, the fracture characteristics, Titan's behavioral state during assessment, and the 6-month timeline. Grasso listened without interrupting and asked 3 specific questions, all of them about the remodeling pattern, and Emily answered them with the kind of specificity that made Grasso stop and look at her. You have a background in this, Grasso said, not a question. I've treated dogs like him before, Emily said. The same answer she'd given Hawkins. The same deliberate economy of words. Grasso looked at her for a half second and then nodded and moved on, because she had a dog to prep for surgery and the time for other questions was later. Hawkins stayed outside the surgical suite. He sat in a chair in the corridor with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped between them and said almost nothing. Emily brought him coffee at some point, black, the way she'd observed him drink it when Patrice Weld had sent someone to offer the federal team refreshments, and he'd waved away the sugar and cream. And he took it without comment. The gesture was small, and the silence around it was large, and Emily understood that kind of silence well enough not to fill it. What she did instead was find a quiet corner of the corridor with her phone and make 2 calls. The first was to a lawyer in Portland who had been her legal counsel 14 years ago and had maintained occasional contact since, a woman named Adaya Zanati who had fought the military bureaucracy to a draw on Emily's behalf and had always believed the fight wasn't finished. Nadi picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd seen the number and said, "Tell me," before Emily could speak. "DCIS is here," Emily said. "They found me through Titan's transfer file." A pause. "How many?" 3 on site. Hollowell is the lead. Diane Hollowell? You know her? By reputation, she's good. Another pause, longer. Emily, is this real this time? Emily watched through the small glass pane in the surgical suite door. Dr. Grasso was working with the focused stillness of someone who had been doing this for a long time. Titan was under anesthesia, his body finally, at rest. It feels different, Emily said. They have corroborating evidence. Hollowell said the files are the key, not the case. That's a meaningful distinction. I know. Are you safe? Right now? Yes. Emily's eyes stayed on the glass. Call me when you're free. I may need you to come out here. The second call was harder. It went to a voicemail she'd expected to reach, and she left a brief message. 3 sentences. Nothing identifiable. The kind of language that people use when they've been careful for a long time, and it's become second nature. Then she stood in the corridor for a moment with her phone in her hand, and the particular stillness of someone who has just set something in motion that cannot be stopped. Inside the surgical suite, Grasso made the first incision at 7:14 in the evening. Emily watched from the corridor until her shift technically ended at 8, and then she stayed because there was nowhere else she was going to be. Patrice Weld found her at 8:20. Patrice had the look of someone who had spent the last several hours revising a narrative and hadn't quite arrived at a satisfying version. She stopped a few feet from Emily and crossed her arms, and the gesture had lost about 60% of its usual authority. Agent Hollowell wants you when you have a minute, Patrice said. I'll be there in a moment. A pause. The federal team set up in Dr. Pryor's conference room. Okay? Another pause. Patrice had something else to say and was working up to it. Emily waited. The imaging you did, Patrice said finally. Briggs looked at it after the surgical team arrived. He said the fracture pattern was textbook for the kind of progressive stress injury that... She stopped, started again. He said it was a significant catch. Emily said nothing. I'm not... Patrice exhaled. I'm not good at this. You don't need to be. Patrice looked at her with an expression Emily couldn't fully read. It had layers, some of which were professional discomfort, and some of which were something more personal and harder to name. Then she uncrossed her arms and walked back toward the nursing station, and Emily went to find Agent Hollowell. Pryor's conference room had been transformed in the way that federal investigators transform spaces, quietly, completely, and with the implication that the transformation was both temporary and entirely beyond the jurisdiction of the person whose name was on the door. 2 laptops open, a whiteboard with a timeline. Emily recognized the outline of immediately. Folders that were thick enough to represent years. Hollowell stood at the whiteboard with a marker in her hand, and Reyes sat at the table with a recorder and a notepad. And the third agent, a woman named Castellano, who Emily now understood handled document review, was sorting through a printed case file with the careful focus of someone who read evidence the way other people read music. Tell me about Operation Iron Shield, Hollowell said, without preamble. Emily sat down. She'd been on her feet for 6 hours. The chair was the specific relief of something earned. What do you already know? I want to know what you know, your version, from the beginning. My version from the beginning goes back 16 years. Then that's where we start. Emily looked at the whiteboard, at the timeline. Some of the names on it she recognized. One of them made something in her chest go tight and specific. 16 years ago, I was a specialist, medical classification, assigned to a unit running canine rehabilitation at a facility outside of Fort Delacroix. The program was called Iron Shield internally. The formal name was different, something bureaucratic that I don't remember. The purpose was supposed to be rehabilitation and reintegration assessment for military working dogs that had sustained service injuries. Supposed to be, Hollowell said. The actual function, which I identified over about 8 months, was that dogs were being cleared for redeployment before they were medically ready because there was a contract structure in place that paid a specific medical contractor, Veradign Systems, per dog cleared. The more dogs cleared, the more money. The clearances were signed off by 3 veterinary officers, 2 of whom I later learned had direct financial ties to Veradign through a shell company. Names of the officers. Emily said them. 3 names she had said only twice in 14 years, both times to lawyers. Hollowell wrote them on the board without reacting. Castellano made a note. What happened when you reported it? I reported it through the chain first. That report went to a major named Hartwick, who was connected to one of the officers I'd named. By the time I understood that and went around him, the original report had been altered. My name on a different version of the document, wording changed to make it look like a personnel grievance rather than a fraud allegation. Emily kept her voice flat. She had practiced this flatness. It was not the same as not feeling it. I went to the Inspector General's office directly. That investigation was opened and closed in 11 weeks. The official finding was insufficient evidence. Was there a finding about your mental fitness? The question was clinical, and Hollowell asked it that way deliberately. Emily appreciated it. There was a psychiatric evaluation requested by Major Hartwick concurrent with the IG investigation. The evaluation found me fit for duty. That finding was not the finding that ended up in my performance record. She paused. What ended up in my performance record was a summary document that referenced the evaluation by date, but replaced the actual finding with language about stress-related impairment. It took me 3 years to get an attorney with enough clearance access to identify the substitution. And your attorney at the time was Adayeze Nnadi. Yes. We've already contacted her office, Hollowell said. She's been briefed. Emily processed that. Nnadi hadn't mentioned it on the phone, which meant either the contact was recent enough that Nnadi had been in the process of deciding how much to say, or Nnadi had been told not to disclose it. Either way, Nnadi had still picked up on the second ring and said, "Tell me," which meant whatever the federal team had said to her hadn't changed her fundamental position. The documents I kept, Emily said. I have the original report, my original, not the altered version. I have photographs of Titan's predecessor dogs, the dogs that were cleared and redeployed in that program period. I have a communication log. I have 2 signed statements from junior enlisted personnel who witnessed clearances being approved for dogs that had been in the program for less than the required recovery period. And I have a financial document, a single page from an internal Veridine budget summary that a contractor employee gave me before she was transferred out of the program. Hollowell had stopped writing on the board. She was looking at Emily with the specific attention of someone who has been building a structure for a long time and has just been handed a piece that changes the load-bearing calculation. The financial document, she said. Does it show the per-clearance payment structure? It shows a payment schedule tied to clearance approval dates, 6 dates in a 4-month period. The corresponding dog records show each of those dogs was cleared within a week of a payment date. The room was quiet. Ms. Carr, Hollowell said, and her voice had shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Where are those documents? My house, 32 minutes from here. We'd like to retrieve them tonight. I know. Emily looked at the whiteboard again, at the name she'd recognized earlier, Colonel Raymond Vass. She'd never met him. She knew him only through the paper trail, through the authorization signatures and the chain of command diagrams and the single email printout she'd obtained through channels she'd never been entirely sure were strictly legal. There's a name on your board, she said. Hollowell looked. Vass, Emily said. How high does he go? Currently, he's retired, 06. He runs a defense consulting firm in Alexandria. A pause. He's been the hardest piece to connect directly. Everything we have is 1 layer removed. I have a memo, Emily said, dated 11 years ago. It's from Vass to Hartwick. It's about me specifically, about ensuring that the IG investigation found no actionable evidence, and about the process for, the language was, managing the documentation environment. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Emily counted them. You have that document, Hollowell said, in a fireproof lockbox underneath a floorboard in my bedroom. Emily stood up. Give me 30 minutes and 2 of your agents and I'll bring you everything. She was almost at the door when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, mid-range, carefully neutral in the way of someone who has used voice modification software or trained themselves out of regional accent. Ms. Carr, it said. We know you're at the hospital. We know what you gave the investigators tonight. This is a courtesy call. Emily did not react visibly. She was aware of Hollowell watching her from across the room. A courtesy call, she repeated, for the room's benefit. The documents you're holding are classified material. Removing them from a federal facility 14 years ago was a crime. We can make that the conversation if you'd prefer. That's not a courtesy call, Emily said. That's a threat. It's a reminder that you have options. I have everything I need, Emily said, and so do the people in this room with me. She lowered the phone from her ear without ending the call, a small, deliberate thing, and looked at Hollowell. Can you trace this? Reyes was already on his own phone. Hollowell crossed the room in 4 steps and took Emily's phone and handed it to Castellano, who plugged something into the headphone port and nodded once. The call was still live on the other end. The voice said nothing for a moment and then said, "You're making a mistake." "Write down the time," Emily said to no one in particular. Her voice was completely steady. Her hands were not, quite. There was the faintest tremor in the left one, the one Hollowell couldn't see from where she was standing, that Emily noticed and controlled and pressed flat against her thigh. "That's the second time in 14 years someone has called me to say that. The first time I listened. Tonight I have a different answer." She took her phone back, ended the call, and looked at Hollowell. "We need to go to my house now," she said. "Whoever that was just confirmed they're watching this building, which means they probably know about my house, and they have a head start." Hollowell was already moving toward the door and calling Reyes's name over her shoulder, and the room shifted from interview to operational in the specific, rapid way of people who have been trained to move when movement is what's needed. Emily followed her into the corridor and stopped, because coming through the main hospital entrance at the far end of the hall, moving with the deliberate, unhurried stride of someone who had made a decision and was now executing it, was a man she recognized from a photograph that was 14 years old and had spent those 14 years in the bottom of her lockbox under a floorboard. A photograph she had never shown anyone except Arayazinadi, and her own reflection in a dark window during the worst nights of the years that followed. He was older. The hair was white now where it had been gray, but the posture was the same. The particular way he carried authority, like something owed. Colonel Raymond Vass walked into Crestview Valley Medical Center at 8:59 in the evening, and he walked in accompanied by 2 men in civilian clothes who moved like they were anything but. And he looked directly down the corridor at Emily Carr with the expression of someone who had come to close something that had been left open for too long. Emily didn't move. That was the thing nobody in the corridor understood in the first 3 seconds. The nurses at the station, Patrice Weld, who had come back around the corner at exactly the wrong moment, the orderly with a linen cart who had stopped mid-push and was staring. Nobody understood why the woman who had just been told to move fast was standing completely still at the far end of the hall, watching a retired colonel walk through the front entrance of a rural Montana hospital at 9 o'clock at night like he owned the deed to it. What they didn't know was that Emily was counting. 2 men flanking Vass, both in civilian clothes, both carrying themselves with the specific compacted readiness of people whose default mode was operational. One had his right hand loose at his side in the way people carry themselves when there's something under the jacket they'd prefer not to reach for in public. The other was scanning the corridor, left, right, ceiling, exits, in a pattern so practiced it had become unconscious. Private security, not federal. The distinction mattered. Hollowell appeared at Emily's shoulder. She'd clocked them in roughly the same amount of time. "Do you know him?" she said, low. "Raymond Vass." Emily said it quietly. "Retired colonel. The name on your board." A half-second pause. Then Hollowell said, very calmly, into the radio clipped to her collar, "Reyes, lobby, now." And then to Emily, without changing her tone, "Step back into the conference room." "No." "Miss Carr, he came here for me," Emily said. "If I go back in the conference room, he knows he has leverage. He doesn't have leverage." Hollowell looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then she moved forward, and Emily moved with her, and the distance between the 2 groups collapsed in the particular way of a corridor that isn't long enough for either side to pretend the other isn't there. Vass stopped about 15 feet from them. Up close, he was larger than the photograph had suggested, broad through the chest, thick-necked, with the kind of physical presence that came from decades of having rooms arrange themselves around him. His face was controlled. Not cold, exactly. More the expression of a man who had prepared for several versions of this conversation and was selecting the appropriate one. "Ms. Carr," he said. His voice was the voice from the phone. She was certain of it in the first syllable. He hadn't used a modifier. It was him, directly, which told her something about how rattled he actually was beneath the surface. "Colonel Vass," she said. Something moved in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to use the name. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what's happening tonight," he said. "I'd like the opportunity to clarify a few things before this gets further than it needs to." "Further than it needs to," Emily repeated the phrase without inflection. "You drove, or flew, to Harlow Falls, Montana at night to clarify things. I have interests in this situation that I'd like to discuss in a more appropriate setting." "You have a warrant?" Hollowell said. Vass looked at her as though noticing her for the first time, which was theater. He'd known exactly who she was before he cleared the entrance. "Agent Hollowell, I wasn't aware DCIS had an active investigation." "There are a lot of things you weren't aware of," Hollowell said. "Do you have a warrant or other legal instrument that gives you standing to be in this building tonight?" "I'm visiting a medical facility." "I don't need a warrant to visit a medical facility." "Then I'm going to ask you to wait in the lobby," Hollowell said, "while I make some calls to verify your identity and your reason for being here. Standard procedure." "I'm happy to wait," Vass said. The compliance was too smooth. He was repositioning. He looked back at Emily, and the look was long enough to communicate something that wasn't in the words. "I hope we can resolve this sensibly." "We're resolving it," Emily said. "Just not the way you came here expecting." Reyes appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving fast, and Hollowell turned to meet him, and in that 30-second window of controlled logistics, Vass said something to the man on his left, too quiet to catch, and the man nodded once. Emily watched the man turn and walk back toward the entrance. "Agent Hollowell," Emily kept her voice level. "One of his people just left." Hollowell turned. The entrance was empty. She got on her radio immediately, clipped terse instructions to whoever was outside, and then looked at Emily with an expression that had sharpened. "We need your documents tonight, not in an hour. Now." "I know. Can you get there without going through the main entrance?" "Staff exit, south side. My truck is in the back lot." "Castellano goes with you." Hollowell said it in a way that didn't allow discussion. "Reyes and I manage Vass. You do not stop, you do not wait, you go directly to your house, and you call me from the road." Emily nodded and turned, and as she moved, she pulled her jacket from the back of a nearby chair. She'd draped it there 7 hours ago when she'd come on shift, and it felt like a different geological era, and pushed through the door to the south corridor without looking back at Vass, because looking back was exactly the kind of signal she wasn't going to give him. Castellano fell into step beside her. She was younger than she'd looked in the conference room, late 20s maybe, with the focused quiet of someone who had been in fieldwork long enough to know that talking used energy better spent on observation. She matched Emily's pace without asking questions, which Emily appreciated. The south exit opened to a staff lot that was half empty at this hour. Emily's truck was a 14 F-150, dark blue, which was easier to find than anything newer because the lot light nearest it had been burned out for 3 months, and maintenance had not come around to fixing it. She drove, and Castellano navigated, though Castellano didn't know the roads and said so, which meant Emily navigated and Castellano watched the mirrors. "Anyone behind us?" Emily asked, 4 minutes out. "Not yet." A pause. "There was a black Range Rover in the guest lot when we came out. Didn't see plates." Emily took the next turn 2 blocks early and went through a residential stretch she knew better than the main road. The houses here were dark at this hour. It was past 9 in a town where most people started work before 6. She watched the mirrors herself and saw nothing definitive, and made 2 more turns she didn't need to make just to be certain. Her house was a single-story rental on a dead-end road that backed onto rangeland. She'd chosen it for the same reason she'd chosen Harlow Falls specifically: distance, simplicity, and a landlord who asked no questions and fixed the furnace when it broke and otherwise left her entirely alone. The porch light was on because she'd left it on this morning, and this morning felt like a week ago. She pulled in and killed the headlights. "Stay close," she said. Inside, the house was exactly as she'd left it. The specific disorder of a person who lives alone and doesn't perform tidiness for an audience. Dishes in the drying rack, a book open face down on the kitchen table, running shoes by the door. Castellano swept it with the efficient discomfort of someone trained to assess spaces for threat, found nothing, and took a position near the front window. Emily went to the bedroom. The floorboard was under the bed, a section of the original hardwood that the house had been built with, pre-renovation, that ran along the wall behind the headboard. She'd identified it in her first week here and spent an afternoon making it functional. She moved the bed far enough to access it. More weight than it looked, and she scraped her knuckle on the frame in the process, which she ignored, and pried up the board with a short flat tool she kept in the nightstand for exactly this purpose. The lockbox was military surplus. Steel, fireproof to 1700 degrees, with a combination she hadn't written down anywhere. She opened it on the floor with her back to the wall, the way she'd imagined doing this exact moment approximately 800 times over the course of 14 years, and the reality of it was both exactly what she'd expected and nothing like it. The documents were there. The photographs were there. The financial page, still in its original evidence sleeve, was there. The memo. Vass to Hartwick, 11 years old, its language precise and damning, and written by a man who had been certain the paper trail would never reach anyone who could use it, was there. She was reaching for the stack when her phone rang. Nadi. "I'm at my house," Emily said. "I have everything." "Don't take it to the hospital." Nadi's voice was tight in a way that was different from her usual precision. "Emily, listen to me. Hollowell's team is solid, but there's been a development in the last 20 minutes. Vass has legal representation that filed an emergency injunction in federal court 40 minutes ago, claiming the DCIS investigation is based on improperly obtained information. It's thin, it won't hold, but it could freeze the evidence transfer for 24 to 48 hours. Emily looked at the documents in her hands. How? He has a contact in the Ninth Circuit Clerk's office who expedited the filing. We've already flagged it. Hollowell's team has a counterfiling going in tonight, but in the window between, the documents can't be formally transferred to federal custody. Correct. Can they be transferred to you? A short pause. As your counsel of record, yes. Under attorney-client privilege, the documents pass through me to the investigation. The injunction covers DCIS evidence custody, not attorney privilege transfer. How fast can you get here? I'm already in Billings. I drove up this afternoon when Hollowell's team contacted me. I'm 2 hours out. Emily put the phone against her shoulder for a moment and looked at the lockbox. At 14 years of precision. At the single page from a Veridine budget document that a woman named Sergeant First Class Dara Pell had pressed into her hand in a parking lot outside Fort Delacroix 14 years ago, 3 days before Pell was transferred to a base in Germany and effectively disappeared from Emily's life. She wondered sometimes what had happened to Pell. She'd never been able to find out. She put the phone back to her ear. 2 hours, she said. Okay. Don't let those documents out of your physical possession until I'm there. Understood. She paused. Araeze. He came to the hospital. Another pause, longer. Vass came personally. Yes. Emily. Nadi's voice had something in it Emily didn't hear often. Not quite alarm, something more controlled than alarm, but in the same family. He's not supposed to know this investigation exists. The only way he knows is if someone inside the DCIS team, or the hospital, Emily said. Pryor made calls. I don't know who she called. Get out of your house, Nadi said. Don't stay there for 2 hours. Find somewhere to be where Voss's people can't find you, and Castellano can secure the location. The documents stay on your person. Emily was already on her feet. I'll call you when I'm in position. She put the documents back in the lockbox, took the lockbox, and walked to the bedroom doorway. Castellano, she said, we need to move. Castellano was already looking at her phone. There's a Range Rover parked at the end of your road, she said. Lights off. It wasn't there when we came in. Emily looked at the front window. The road beyond the porch light was dark in the way of rural dark, which was very dark, and at the far end of it there was the specific quality of shadow that comes from a large vehicle sitting without illumination. Back door, Emily said. They went through the kitchen, out the back door, and into the rangeland behind the house. There was no path. There was grass and sage and uneven ground and the kind of cold that comes off Montana flatland at night, like something with intention, and Emily moved through it with the lockbox under her arm, and Castellano a half step behind her with her hand near her jacket. Emily's phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which meant Hollowell's team was using secondary communications. The text said, Vass's second man was flagged trying to access hospital medical records terminal. Lobby. Reyes has him. Stay off main roads. She showed it to Castellano without breaking stride. He wanted your file, Castellano said. Your employment record. He wanted to know what name I'm using and whether there's anything in the hospital system that gives him a legal angle. Is there? My nursing license is current and clean. There's nothing in the hospital system that gives him anything. A pause. Except the imaging I did tonight. The fracture documentation. He'd try to suppress that? He'd try to argue I performed unauthorized veterinary medical assessment in a human medical facility, which gives him grounds to challenge the chain of custody on anything I identified. Emily stepped over a drainage channel she couldn't see, but knew was there from the time she'd walked this land on sleepless nights. It's not a strong argument, but it's something to file. Castellano was quiet for a moment. You've been planning for this. I've been planning for the version of this where everything goes wrong, Emily said. Tonight is the version where some things go wrong. That's better than I expected. They came out on a gravel access road that served the ranches east of town, and Emily called a number she had not called in 18 months. It rang 4 times, and then a man answered with the specific alertness of someone who had not been asleep and had been waiting for exactly this kind of call. His name was Walt Deering. He was 63 years old and had been a livestock veterinarian in Harlow Falls for 31 years and had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic in what felt like someone else's life. He had no connection to Iron Shield, no connection to Vass, no connection to anything that had happened 14 years ago. He was simply the first person Emily had trusted in Harlow Falls, and the only one she trusted completely, for the particular reason that he had never once asked her anything she didn't offer first. I need to use your barn, she said. Already got the light on, he said, and hung up. They walked 40 minutes across open land to reach it. Castellano's shoes were wrong for the terrain, and she didn't mention it and didn't slow down, which elevated her considerably in Emily's estimation. The barn was a working structure. Hay, 2 horses, the smell of animals and old wood that Emily found. In this particular moment, something close to steadying. Walt was there with a thermos of coffee and the expression of a man who had decided not to ask questions and was comfortable with that decision. He looked at Castellano once, assessed her, and handed her a cup. Emily set the lockbox on a workbench and opened it and went through the document to verify their existence, but because she needed to know they were intact and in order, the sequence, the dates, the specific pieces that connected to the corroborating evidence Hollowell's team already had. The financial document was first. Single-page, Veradign Systems internal budget notation, dated in a month when 3 dogs had been cleared for redeployment in a 7-day span. The clearance fees were listed against project codes that corresponded to dog unit designations. Emily had matched those codes to service records. The correlation was not coincidental. The photographs were next. 12 images. Dogs in rehabilitation that had been documented as cleared. Documentation she had obtained from the program records before access was revoked. The dates on the photographs and the dates on the clearance forms did not match. The injuries visible in the photographs were not consistent with the medical status described in the clearance forms. The memo was last. Vass to Hartwick. The language was bureaucratic and careful in the way of someone who believed they were writing for internal eyes only, which meant the meaning was clear to anyone who understood the institutional shorthand. Managing the documentation environment meant altering records. Ensuring continuity of the program assessment framework meant keeping the clearance pipeline running. Addressing the concerns raised by Specialist Carr through appropriate internal channels meant burying her report where it couldn't be found. She had read this memo so many times that she knew it by the position of its words on the page rather than the words themselves. And yet reading it now, in a barn in Montana, with a federal investigator beside her and her attorney 2 hours away, and Raymond Vass somewhere in Harlow Falls making phone calls to prevent exactly this moment, Emily felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Not yet. Something more complicated than that. The specific ache of being right about a thing you spent 14 years wishing you'd been wrong about, because being right meant all of it had actually happened, and all the dogs, and all the handlers who trusted the clearances, and all the years of quiet that had been a kind of armor and a kind of exile simultaneously. Castellano's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Reyes has the second man in custody. Attempting to access restricted hospital records is obstruction. They're processing him now. What about Vass? He's still in the lobby. His attorney arrived 20 minutes ago. A pause. His attorney is arguing that Vass has a right to consult with the subject of a federal investigation, meaning you, as a concerned party. That's not a legal right. No, it's a delay tactic. Castellano looked at her. Hollowell wants to know if you'll consent to a recorded conversation with Vass. Controlled setting, federal observers present. She thinks he might say something. Emily thought about it for 3 seconds. 3 actual counted seconds. Then she said, yes. Castellano relayed it. They drove back to the hospital in Walt Deering's truck because it was nondescript and because the Range Rover at the end of Emily's road was presumably still watching for her blue F-150. Walt drove without being asked and dropped them at the south entrance and drove away without a word, and Emily thought that there were very few people in her life she'd be able to describe as genuinely good without qualification, and Walt Deering was one of them. The hospital at this hour had the specific quality of a night shift well underway. The reduced staff, the different register of sounds, the overhead lights at the end of some corridors switched to half power. Hollowell met them at the south entrance and walked beside Emily without speaking until they were away from the main corridor. Grasso finished surgery, she said. Titan is in recovery. The fracture was stabilized. She said it went as well as it could have gone. Emily let that land, just for a moment. Hawkins? Still here. He's in the recovery area. Good. The injunction filing is weak, Hollowell continued. Our legal team is confident the counterfiling will dissolve it within 12 hours. But Vass knows that. He's not trying to win on the injunction. He's trying to buy time for something else. She paused. We found the connection between Vass and the phone call to your cell tonight. One of his security contractors made the call on a device registered to a shell company that ties to Veridyne's successor firm. Veridyne has a successor firm? Rebranded 10 years ago. They're still in the military contract space. 2 active contracts with DoD. Hollowell's voice was even. Both of those contracts are going to be reviewed. Emily stopped walking. They were in the corridor outside Pryor's conference room, and through the glass she could see the whiteboard with its names and its timeline and the specific weight of 14 years condensed into bullet points and connecting lines. How many dogs? She said. Total. Across the full program period. Hollowell was quiet for a moment. Our current estimate, based on records we've accessed through the separate investigation, is 43 animals, across 7 years of the program. The number settled. 43. Not an abstraction. 43 working dogs. Animals that had earned their retirement through service, that had trusted the systems and the people who managed those systems to protect them. Cleared for redeployment through fraudulent assessments, sent back into conditions their bodies couldn't handle for the purpose of keeping a payment schedule running. The handlers, Emily said. What happened to the handlers? We're still mapping that. Several reported injuries to their dogs that were officially attributed to service incidents. We have 3 reported cases of early euthanasia of dogs whose conditions deteriorated rapidly after redeployment. Conditions that, based on what you've documented and what we've found, were likely pre-existing and unaddressed. Emily turned and went into the conference room. She set the lockbox on the table and opened it, and she placed each document on the table in the sequence she'd established 14 years ago, the sequence that built the argument from foundation to apex. And Hollowell and Castellano and Reyes, who had come in behind them, stood around the table and looked at it. The financial document first, Emily said, then the photographs. The photographs are matched to the clearance records you should already have from Fort Delacroix. The project codes will correspond. The memo is last because the memo connects Vass directly to the decision-making. Hollowell picked up the financial document with gloved hands. She read it for 30 seconds. She set it down with the care of someone handling something that was going to matter in a courtroom. Castellano, she said without looking up, get the evidence bags. The documentation process took 40 minutes. Emily sat in a chair at the edge of the room and watched it, and the watching had a specific quality, like witnessing the conclusion of something that had been in motion so long it had become part of the background, part of the structure of ordinary life. And seeing it finally arrive at its end was both a relief and disorienting in the way that the end of any long, heavy thing is disorienting. At 11:14 in the evening, Hollowell looked up from the table and said, "We're ready for Vass." He came in with his attorney, a man named Pfeiffer, who had the expensive haircut and the practiced neutrality of someone who billed by the quarter hour. And he sat down across from Emily with the specific performance of a man who had decided that the best remaining strategy was to appear untroubled. He was good at it. He had probably been good at it his entire career. But Emily was looking at his hands, and his hands were doing something small and involuntary. A tight, repeated press of his thumb against the side of his index finger that she'd seen before in people who were managing something they were trying not to show. "Ms. Carr," he said, "I appreciate you agreeing to speak." "I didn't agree to speak," Emily said. "I agreed to listen. There's a difference." Pfeiffer moved to object to something, and Hollowell's look stopped him before the sentence formed. Vass adjusted. "I want you to understand that whatever you think happened 14 years ago is more complicated than the version you have." "I don't think," Emily said. "I documented." "Documentation can be—" "The memo is in federal custody," Emily said. "Your memo, to Hartwick, the one about managing the documentation environment." She watched his face. The involuntary press of his thumb stopped. "The financial document from Veridine is in federal custody. The photographs, matched to the clearance forms, are in federal custody." She paused. "There's nothing left to manage." The silence that followed was the specific kind that comes when a person's strategy has been surgically removed from beneath them and they haven't yet decided what to do with what remains. Vass's attorney leaned in and said something in his ear. Vass said, "I'd like a moment." Hollowell stood. "Take whatever moment you need." She looked at Reyes. "Get the assistant U.S. attorney on the phone." They filed out, Hollowell, Reyes, Castellano, leaving Emily in the room with Vass and his attorney, and Emily did not move to leave because she had not been asked to and because she was curious about one specific thing. Vass looked at her across the table. His attorney was typing on a phone. In the absence of the federal agents, something in Vass's performance had dropped slightly, not entirely, but enough to make the man beneath it briefly visible. He looked tired. Not guilty, not yet. That was a different tiredness that came later. But the tiredness of someone who has been managing a weight for a long time and has just felt it shift from something controllable to something that will crush him. "You kept it all," he said, not accusatory, almost wondering. "Yes," Emily said. "For 14 years." "Yes." He looked at the table. "Why didn't you go to the press?" Emily thought about it. She could have given him a tactical answer, that the press would have been easier to suppress, that a classified case needed federal traction, that the documentation wasn't ready. All of it was true. But what she actually said was, "Because I wanted it done right, not fast. Right." Vass looked at her for a moment that had the quality of a reckoning, the specific reckoning of someone who has spent years assuming a person they destroyed had stayed destroyed. The conference room door opened. Reyes stood in the doorway with an expression Emily had not seen on his face before. Not alarm, but the contained intensity of someone delivering news that changes the room. He looked at Hollowell, who was behind him, and then at Emily, and then he said, "The assistant U.S. attorney just called. The Veridine successor company filed for federal protection 20 minutes ago. Preemptive. Their legal team contacted the FBI 48 hours ago with a proffer." Hollowell stepped into the room. "They're cooperating," she said. "They have internal records going back 9 years, payment records, communication logs." She looked at Emily and then at Vass, and the look she gave Vass had the specific quality of someone completing a sequence of steps. "Colonel Vass," she said, "I'm going to ask you to stay in this room." She produced something from her jacket. Vass's attorney said, "This is a federal warrant," Hollowell said, "for the arrest of Raymond Vass on charges of fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of authority, issued 45 minutes ago by a federal judge in the District of Montana." She placed it on the table. "We were waiting to confirm your physical location." Vass did not speak. He looked at the warrant on the table and then he looked at Emily, and whatever he'd intended that look to contain, defiance, calculation, something else, what actually came through was something older and less controlled than any of that. Reyes moved around the table. Emily stood and stepped back toward the wall because she did not need to be in the center of what happened next and did not want to be. She watched Reyes position himself and heard the procedural language begin and felt, in the wall at her back, the specific solidity of something that had been standing for 14 years and was still there. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Short, 5 words. Grasso says Titan is awake. Emily read it twice. She put the phone in her pocket. And then, in the far corner of a conference room in a regional hospital in Harlow Falls, Montana, while a retired colonel was being read his rights 8 feet away from her, she pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth and held it there for 3 seconds. Not crying, not quite, but the thing that lives just underneath crying in people who have spent a very long time not doing it. And then she took her hand away and straightened and breathed. Hollowell caught her eye from across the room. Hollowell gave her a single, small nod. Emily returned it, and the noise of the arrest was still going on around them when the conference room door opened a second time, and a night shift nurse Emily had never spoken to more than twice pushed in with wide eyes and said, "There are more federal vehicles outside, a lot more, and there's—" She stopped, looked at the scene in front of her, recalibrated. "There are 2 more men in the lobby asking for Agent Hollowell. They're in military uniform. They say they're from the Judge Advocate General's office." Hollowell turned to Reyes and said something Emily couldn't hear over the distance and the noise. Reyes finished securing Vass and straightened and looked at Hollowell with an expression that said he'd heard the same thing Emily had heard and was waiting for the same answer. "Tell them to come in," Hollowell said. Emily watched the door. The JAG officers who came through it were both in full uniform, both with the posture of people who had traveled fast to be here. The one in front, a lieutenant colonel, female, with close-cropped hair and the expression of someone who had read a very large file very recently, looked around the room until she found Emily. "Ms. Carr," she said. She had a folder under her arm that was thick enough to represent a significant bureaucratic effort. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mara Finch, Judge Advocate General's Corps. We received a classified transfer request 3 hours ago that appears to involve your service record." She paused. "We need to discuss some corrections that should have been made a long time ago." She opened the folder, and on the first page Emily could see, from where she stood across the room, her own name, and below it a document classification header, and below that, typed in the formal language of military administrative correction, a phrase that she had last seen inverted, distorted, weaponized against her, and was now rendered in its original and accurate form. What she could not see yet was what came below it. She crossed the room and looked. The document below her name was 3 pages long, and she read all of it standing up, which was not how she had imagined doing this if she'd let herself imagine it at all, which mostly she hadn't, because imagining it had felt for a very long time like the kind of thing that cost more than it was worth. The language was formal and dense in the way of military administrative documents, which was a kindness in its own way. It meant the most significant things were stated plainly, without the kind of interpretive softness that would have made them harder to absorb. The psychiatric evaluation finding had been restored to its original language: fit for duty, no evidence of stress-related impairment, assessment conducted under duress. The performance record notation had been corrected. The discharge classification, which had followed her like a shadow for 14 years, appearing on background checks and licensing reviews in ways that required explanation every time, had been formally revised. And at the bottom of the 3rd page, in the specific bureaucratic phrasing that the military used for things it found difficult to say directly, was a sentence that amounted to an acknowledgement that the original fraud report filed by Specialist Emily Carr had been accurate, that the suppression of that report had been deliberate, and that the institutional response to her whistleblowing had been improper. Lieutenant Colonel Finch was watching her read, not impatiently, more with the careful attention of someone who understood what they were delivering and was giving it appropriate weight. Emily looked up. "This is the administrative correction," Finch said. "The criminal proceedings are separate and are proceeding through DCIS and the U.S. Attorney's Office. But the record correction doesn't wait for the criminal outcome. It can be executed immediately upon your signature acknowledging receipt." "I know how it works," Emily said. "Not sharp, just accurate." Finch nodded. "There's also a formal letter of acknowledgement from the Secretary of the Army's office. It's in the 2nd folder." She held out a thinner folder that Emily hadn't noticed her carrying. "It's not a public document unless you choose to make it public. That's entirely your decision." Emily took the 2nd folder. She didn't open it. "The corrections to the performance record. Do they include the psychiatric notation?" "Every alteration to your original record has been identified and reversed. The process was thorough. We had 3 separate records officers working on it over the past 72 hours. Finch paused. Agent Hollowell's team flagged your file to us 4 days ago when the investigation reached the point where the records falsification became actionable. We moved as fast as the administrative process allows. 4 days. Emily thought about that. While she had been working Wednesday afternoon shifts and eating dinner alone and living the specific life of someone who had learned to keep their perimeter small, the machinery of official correction had been moving toward her without her knowledge, which was a strange thing to hold alongside 14 years of fighting to make that machinery move at all. "I need a pen," Emily said. Finch produced one. Emily signed the acknowledgement of receipt on the first folder's signature line, and the act of it was nothing like what she would have expected. Not dramatic, not releasing, not the closed door of something finally finished. It felt like signing any document. The significance was in what it represented, not in the physical act, and she had always understood that intellectually, but the gap between understanding something intellectually and experiencing it directly was, in this moment, wider than she'd expected. She handed the pen back. "There will be follow-up process," Finch said. "Notifications to licensing boards that received the erroneous performance record, corrections to background check databases. That process takes 4 to 6 weeks." "I know. And there may be civil remedies available to you depending on what the criminal investigation uncovers about specific individuals' liability. Your attorney would be the person to—" "Arezinati is on her way from Billings," Emily said. "She'll be here within the hour." "We know Ms. Nadi," Finch said, and something shifted very briefly in her expression. Not quite amusement, more the recognition of a name that carried a specific kind of institutional reputation. "She's effective." "Yes," Emily said. "She is." Across the room, Vass was being walked toward the conference room door by Reyes and a second agent who had come in with the JAG team. His attorney was on his phone with the specific posture of a man trying to find a number fast enough to matter. Vass himself had said nothing since Hollowell had placed the warrant on the table, a silence that was not dignified exactly, but was the best available option for a man who had spent his career knowing when the remaining moves were all bad ones. He passed Emily on the way to the door. He didn't look at her. She noticed. The deliberateness of it. The way a person who has looked directly at you your entire life suddenly finds the middle distance more interesting, was its own kind of acknowledgement. She let him pass. The corridor outside the conference room had changed. In the time Emily had been inside with the documents and the warrant and Lieutenant Colonel Finch, the hospital had shifted into a different register. There were federal vehicles in the parking lot visible through the lobby windows. 3 of them, one of which was marked in the way of U.S. Marshals rather than DCIS. And the lobby itself had a cluster of hospital staff near the reception desk, grouped in the way of people who are not patients and are not going anywhere and are watching something they don't entirely understand but can read the gravity of. Patrice Weld was among them. She stood at the edge of the group with her arms at her sides rather than crossed, which was, for Patrice, a significant posture. Dr. Briggs was there. 2 of the night shift nurses Emily knew by face and first name, but had never had a conversation with that lasted more than 3 minutes. Dr. Pryor was not in the lobby. Emily found out where Pryor was approximately 4 minutes later when she came around the corridor toward the south wing and found Pryor standing outside the door to the staff break room with a styrofoam cup in her hand and the expression of someone who had been standing there long enough for the coffee to go cold. Pryor looked at her, and Emily looked at Pryor. And what passed between them in that moment was not an apology. Pryor was not, at her core, an apologizing person, and Emily had made her peace with that long ago. But something more honest than an apology, which was the look of someone who is confronted with the full scope of what they did not know and did not try to know, and now has to decide what to do with that. "The JAG officers," Pryor said. "They asked to see your employment record." "I know. I showed them." A pause. "I thought they were reviewing your credentials." "They were," Emily said. "In a way." Pryor looked at her cup. "I owe you an explanation about some things." "You don't," Emily said. "You treated me the way you had the information to treat me. Your information was incomplete." She stopped. She considered. "What you do owe me is a fair assessment going forward, when the information is more complete. That's all." Pryor looked up. She seemed to have expected something else, something more, and the absence of it had left her with a gap she didn't know how to fill. "The records you submitted tonight," she said. "The imaging, the fracture assessment. Briggs reviewed it with Grasso before surgery. He said it was... She stopped again, started over. He asked how you identified a stress fracture of that pattern from palpation alone. Experience, Emily said. What kind of experience? The kind that doesn't show up in a standard nursing profile. Emily moved toward the south wing. I have to check on a patient. She wasn't talking about a human patient. Pryor understood that and let her go. The recovery area where Titan had been placed was a repurposed procedure room at the end of the south wing. Not ideal, but functional, which was the best available option when you were conducting veterinary recovery in a human medical facility. Dr. Grasso had stayed past the surgical completion to manage the first phase of recovery, which said something about Grasso that Emily filed away. Hawkins was in a chair outside the door, and when Emily came around the corner, he stood up with the specific alertness of someone who had been sitting still for hours and whose body had not stopped being tense the entire time. How is he? Emily said. Awake. Hawkins' voice was rough. Grasso said the stabilization went well, that the fracture was, she said it was more progressed than the imaging showed, that there was secondary damage. He stopped. She said if he'd gone another few months, he stopped again, and Emily didn't push it, because the sentence didn't need its ending. Can I go in? She asked. He opened the door for her. Titan was on a low recovery surface that the surgical team had rigged from 2 padded tables pushed together, which was exactly the kind of improvised solution that worked because the people doing it knew what they were doing. He was drowsy. Anesthesia and exhaustion together, the particular heaviness of an animal that has been carrying pain for so long that its absence reads, initially, as something unfamiliar. He lifted his head when Emily came in. Not fully, just enough to track her. She sat down on the floor beside him. Not a chair, the floor, at his level. She put her hand on his shoulder and held it there, not moving, and the dog made a sound deep in his chest that was not quite a whine and not quite anything else, and then put his head back down on the surface with the weight of something that has decided it's safe to stop fighting for a moment. Emily sat with him for a while. She wasn't thinking about Vass or the warrant or Finch or the documents or the 14 years or any of the specific architecture of what the night had been. She was sitting on the floor of a procedure room in a hospital in Montana with a 90-pound Belgian Malinois who had spent months in pain that people with authority and credentials had repeatedly told his handler was not real, and the direct physical fact of that, the warmth of the dog's shoulder under her hand, the slow and gradually steadying rhythm of his breathing, was, in this particular moment, what everything else had been for. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it without moving her hand. Naughty. 30 minutes out. Then a text from Hollowell. Hartwick identified. North Carolina. Local FBI making contact tonight. Then another, 3 minutes after the first. Veridine Successor Company. Paragon Defense Systems. Internal cooperation extending to active contracts. Dodie Contracting Office notified. Both active contracts suspended pending investigation. Emily read them all and put the phone away. She sat with Titan until Grasso came back in for a scheduled check at 1 in the morning, and Emily stood, and her knees were stiff from the floor, and she didn't particularly care, and she stepped back to give Grasso room and watched the veterinary surgeon work with the same focused efficiency she'd had in the operating room, and then some, because outside the OR, without the structure of a procedure, a surgeon's real competence shows differently, and Grasso's was evident. He's stable, Grasso said, without being asked. Pain indicators are good. The next 12 hours are the critical window for infection risk, but I'm not seeing any early flags. She looked at Emily. You want me to walk you through the post-op protocol? Yes, Emily said. And then I want you to teach me anything about it I don't already know. Grasso looked at her for a moment with an expression that was partway between professional curiosity and something more personal. Who trained you? She said. Originally, with the dogs. Emily considered how much to say. Grasso wasn't inside the investigation. She wasn't a threat, and she wasn't an obstacle. She was just a veterinary surgeon who had done excellent work tonight and who was asking a reasonable question. Program called Iron Shield, Emily said. Military. A long time ago. Grasso nodded slowly. I've heard that name, she said, in a context that wasn't good. No, Emily agreed. It wasn't. They went through the post-op protocol, and Emily asked 2 questions that came from specific experience and Grasso answered them with the specificity they deserved. And by the end of it, something had shifted slightly in the register of their interaction. Not friendship, not yet, but the particular mutual recognition of people who share a body of knowledge and are discovering the overlap. Area's Nadi arrived at 1:47 in the morning. She came through the south entrance with a rolling bag and the contained forward momentum of a woman who had driven 2 hours in the dark and was fully operational at the end of it. She was 52, Nigerian-British by origin and American by 30 years of practice, with natural hair cut close and reading glasses pushed up on her head and a presence that didn't require volume. Emily had seen her dismantle a military attorney's argument in a pre-trial hearing using nothing but his own paperwork and a patience that had looked, to the uninformed observer, like passivity right up until it wasn't. She stopped when she saw Emily and looked at her for one full second in the specific way of someone who has been worried about a person without quite admitting it, and then she said, "You look terrible." "I've been awake for 22 hours. "The documents?" "In federal custody. Finch has been here with the record correction. Vass is in custody." Emily paused. "Hartwick is being contacted in North Carolina as we speak." Nadi closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. "The injunction?" "Dissolved. Hollowell's counterfiling landed before midnight. The judge dismissed it in 2 hours, which is apparently fast." "It was a garbage filing," Nadi said. "I read it on the drive. I could have dismissed it in 20 minutes. She looked around the corridor. "Where's Hollowell?" "Conference room. Pryor's office." "Take me." They walked together and Nadi did not reach for Emily's arm or do any of the physical things that people do when they want to communicate support and don't know how to say it plainly, which was one of the things Emily had always appreciated about her. Instead, she said, while they walked, "The record correction. Did you read all 3 pages?" "Yes." "The psychiatric notation specifically?" "Yes." "And?" Emily thought about how to answer. "It's accurate now," she said. "That's what matters." "That's not what I asked." "I know." Emily pushed open the door to the main corridor. "I'll tell you what it felt like when I've slept." Nadi made a sound that was not quite agreement, but wasn't disagreement either. The conference room had shifted in Emily's absence. Hollowell had 2 additional agents present now, people Emily hadn't seen before, which suggested they'd arrived with the marshal's vehicles. And there was a second whiteboard that had been brought in and was covered in a timeline that was more detailed than the first. The documents Emily had provided were in evidence bags on a side table, cataloged and labeled, and the specific order of them, the order Emily had laid them out, the sequence she'd built, was visible even through the plastic. Nadi assessed the room in approximately 3 seconds and went directly to Hollowell. Emily stood at the edge of the room and watched the 2 of them talk. The particular conversation of professionals who have overlapping jurisdictions and mutual respect and differing interests that need to be navigated carefully. And she was aware, in a way she hadn't been earlier, of how tired she was. Not just tonight tired, the other kind. Hollowell crossed the room to Emily while Nadi reviewed the evidence log. "There's something you should know," Hollowell said, low. "We've been running a parallel track on the Veridine financial documents. Paragon's cooperation is more extensive than we initially represented. They've been cooperating for 3 months. The proffer they filed 48 hours ago was the last piece of a process that started in March." Emily looked at her. "What does that mean for the timeline?" It means the arrest tonight was planned. Not tonight specifically. We were tracking Vass's location and waiting for a window where we could confirm he'd made contact with you, which gives us the harassment and obstruction charges on top of the underlying fraud." Hollowell paused. "We needed him to come to you." The implication of that took a moment to settle. "You were monitoring his movements." "For 6 weeks. And you knew he'd come here when the investigation got close enough." "We believed it was likely. We didn't know it would be tonight, or this fast. The speed was... Vass moved faster than we anticipated, which actually worked in our favor." Hollowell looked at the evidence table. "The documents you brought tonight, they're significant, Emily. The Vass memo specifically. Paragon's financial records corroborate the payment structure. The photographs corroborate the clearance timeline. Together, they close the evidentiary loop in a way that neither set of documents could do alone. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been waiting for the loop to close. How long until charges are formally filed?" "Tomorrow morning. Full charging document. Fraud, obstruction, conspiracy, abuse of authority. Vass, Hartwick, and 2 former Veridine executives who are named in Paragon's proffer. She paused. 3 others are still being identified. We expect the full list by end of week. Emily looked at the whiteboard, at the names, at the timeline, at the architecture of something she had started building when she was 24 years old, and a specialist in a canine rehabilitation program, and had believed, with the specific belief of someone who doesn't yet know how these things go, that reporting what she'd found to the right people would result in something being done about it. I want to ask you something, Emily said. Hollowell waited. The 43 dogs, the ones cleared fraudulently. Is there a record, a complete record, of which ones were redeployed, what happened to them, whether their handlers know? We're building it, Hollowell said. It's part of the remediation process. Handler notification is going to be a significant element of how this resolves publicly. A pause. Some of those handlers have been told for years that their dog's injuries were service-related, that the deterioration after redeployment was unpredictable. That's going to need to be corrected. Corrected, Emily said. The word had an insufficient weight for what it was describing. Those handlers need to know the truth. They will. Hollowell said it plainly, without the qualifying softness of a promise that might not be kept. Just, they will. Emily took it as the thing it was. She left Hollowell with Noddy and went back to the South Wing corridor and sat down in the chair outside Titan's recovery room that Hawkins had vacated at some point. She didn't know when he'd left it, but he was gone, and the chair was there. And she sat in it and did not try to process anything for a few minutes, which was the only kind of rest available to her at 1:50 in the morning in a hospital hallway. She was still sitting there when her phone rang. Unknown number. Different from the earlier one. Different prefix. Different pattern. She answered it. The voice on the other end was male, older, with a specific regional flatness that she placed somewhere in the mid-Atlantic corridor. Ms. Carr, it said. My name is Gerald Ossian. I'm General Counsel for Paragon Defense Systems. Emily said nothing. I've been authorized by our senior leadership to reach out to you directly, Ossian said. In the context of our cooperation with the federal investigation, we believe there are aspects of our company's relationship with Operation Iron Shield that... I'm going to stop you, Emily said. I'm going to give you Agent Hollowell's direct number, and you're going to call her. I'm not a party to the federal investigation in the capacity you're treating me as. I'm a witness. We understand that. The number is... She gave it. Call her. Tonight. She's still there. She paused. And Mr. Ossian, whatever you're about to offer or disclose, it's going to come out regardless. The cooperation that helps you most is the most complete cooperation, not the most strategic. She ended the call. She stared at the corridor wall for a moment. The paint was the specific institutional beige of every hospital corridor she'd ever worked in, and it occurred to her that she didn't particularly want to look at institutional beige for the rest of her professional life, which was a thought she hadn't let herself have in quite that way before, as a choice, as something with options attached to it, rather than as a fixed condition. Down the hall, a door opened. Hawkins came out of a break room she hadn't known he'd been in, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he stopped when he saw her. Oh, he said, you're here. Just sitting, Emily said. He came and handed her one of the cups, which was the specific wordless competence of someone who had spent years operating in conditions where you took care of the person next to you because that was what you did, and sat down in the chair along the opposite wall. They drank coffee in silence for a while. The hospital made its nighttime sounds around them. Somewhere in the south wing, Titan's breathing was slow and steady, and the absence of pain in it was new enough to matter. What happens now? Hawkins said eventually. To him, to Titan, realistically. Grasso will have a better picture in 48 hours. The fracture was complex. He'll need extended recovery. Probably months, not weeks. He won't be a working dog again. She said it directly. She'd learned that people who had been living with uncertainty found direct information easier than cushioned information, even when the information was hard. But he should have full mobility. With proper rehabilitation, most of his function back. He'll have a good life, just a different one. Hawkins was quiet. He was supposed to retire anyway, a year ago. They kept finding reasons to extend his service. I know. Because retiring him meant admitting he was injured, which meant admitting the clearances were wrong. He looked at his cup. I knew something was wrong. I kept filing reports, kept getting told I was the problem. That's how it works, Emily said. The person who notices becomes the problem. It's easier than addressing what they noticed. Hawkins looked at her. Is that what happened to you 14 years ago? Yes? And you stayed anyway. You didn't, I don't know, quit, walk away from it. I walked away from the military, Emily said. I came here. That was a version of walking away. She drank her coffee. It was bad coffee, the specific bad coffee of hospital break rooms at 2 in the morning, and it was also exactly what she needed. But I kept the files, so I didn't walk all the way. A door at the far end of the corridor opened. Reyes came through it with purpose, looking for her, and when he found her, he stopped and spoke from a distance rather than coming all the way down the hall. Hollowell wants you, he said. Now. Emily stood. Something happened? Hartwick, Reyes said. FBI made contact in North Carolina. He paused. He asked for immunity in exchange for a full proffer. His attorney says he has documentation we don't have yet. Records from inside Fort Delacroix. The original program records, the ones we thought were destroyed. Emily was already walking. They're not destroyed, she said, almost to herself. No, Reyes said, keeping pace. And Hartwick says there are names on them that we haven't identified yet. Active duty names. People still serving. He paused. Hollowell says the investigation just tripled in scope. They pushed through the door into the main corridor, and Emily could see the conference room from here, its lights at full, and the shapes of people moving inside it with the specific energy of something expanding beyond its original container. And she could see through the glass that Hollowell was on the phone and that her face had the expression of someone receiving news that confirmed a structure larger than anticipated, and that Nadi was standing beside her reading a document being fed off a printer in real time, and that Finch had come back into the room and was on her own phone with what appeared to be a different level of urgency than she'd had an hour ago. Something had shifted. Emily could feel it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure. Not visible, not audible, but present in a way that the body registers before the mind catches up. Reyes opened the conference room door for her. Hollowell looked up from her phone and said, without preamble, Hartwick's documentation includes communications between Vass and a currently serving 2-star general who was, 14 years ago, the commanding officer of the installation where Iron Shield operated. Emily held the doorframe. A 2-star, she said. Major General Wallace Pruitt, currently commanding officer at Fort Burnham, Georgia. Hollowell's voice had the flat precision of someone delivering information that they have confirmed 3 times before speaking. Hartwick says Pruitt didn't just know about the clearance fraud. He architected the financial arrangement with Veridine. Vass was the operational layer. Pruitt was the structure above him. She paused. If Hartwick's documentation holds, we have a sitting 2-star general who has been running defense contract fraud from inside an active military installation for over a decade. The room was very quiet. Nadi looked at Emily over the top of the document she was reading. Emily looked back, and in the look between them was the specific understanding of 2 people who had spent 14 years navigating the lower levels of a structure without knowing how high it went, and who were now, at 2:15 in the morning in a regional hospital in Montana, looking up at the ceiling of it for the first time. How quickly can you move on Pruitt? Emily said. That's the problem, Hollowell said. He's on a military installation. The jurisdiction it's complicated. We need the Secretary of the Army's office directly involved, and we need it tonight, before word gets to Pruitt that Hartwick has flipped. She looked at Finch. Lieutenant Colonel. Finch was already on her phone. If he gets warning, Reyes said, if he has time to... I know, Hollowell said. Emily looked at the whiteboard, at the timeline, at the names already on it, and the space above them where the structure above Vass had been a blank for 14 years, and was now, at this specific moment, still blank, the name not yet written, the outcome not yet fixed, balanced on the edge of Finch's phone call, and the speed of institutional response, and whatever Hartwick's documentation actually contained. 14 years of building toward this moment. And the moment wasn't finished yet. Finch's call lasted 11 minutes. Emily knew because she was standing close enough to track the time on the wall clock above the whiteboard, and she watched each of those 11 minutes pass with the specific attention of someone who understands that the outcome of a phone call can determine whether years of work lands or dissipates, and there is nothing to do about that except wait and watch the second-hand move and not fill the silence with anything that doesn't need to be said. The room held itself. Hollowell stood near the evidence table with her arms crossed, not defensively, just contained, the posture of someone managing their own tension. Reyes had a notepad but wasn't writing anything. Nadi was reading Hartwick's preliminary proffer document that Reyes had printed and handed her 20 minutes ago, turning pages with the focused quiet of someone who reads evidence the way surgeons read imaging, not for the story of it, but for the specific detail that changes the interpretation of everything around it. Finch said, "Yes, sir," twice in the last 30 seconds of the call. Then she lowered the phone and looked at Hollowell. "The Secretary's office is coordinating with CID and the Joint Chiefs Inspector General," she said. "Fort Burnham is being contacted through the installation's senior JAG officer, who is not in Pruitt's chain of command and has been cleared for notification. Pruitt is currently on post, confirmed 40 minutes ago through routine security logging." She paused. "They're moving tonight." Hollowell exhaled. Not dramatically, just a single, controlled breath that communicated the release of a specific, contained weight. "How long?" "CID team is 2 hours from Fort Burnham. They had a team pre-positioned in Atlanta as of yesterday. Hartwick's attorney made contact with FBI early enough that there was preparation." Finch looked at her phone and then at Emily. "The Secretary's office wants a summary of the originating documentation tonight, specifically the Vasta Hartwick memo and the financial correlation. They need it for the legal basis of the installation access." "It's in evidence custody," Hollowell said. "I know. I'm asking for a summary. From Ms. Carr, if she's willing. She's the person who can speak to the documentation's origins most accurately." Emily looked at Nadi. Nadi looked up from the proffer document. "I'll be in the room," she said. It wasn't a question. "Obviously," Finch said. They used the far end of the conference table, and Emily talked for 22 minutes into Finch's phone while a JAG paralegal on the other end took notes, and she was precise and linear and did not editorialize, which was how she had always given information, in the sequence that built understanding rather than in the sequence that built drama, because understanding was what the information was for. She described the memo's origin, the financial document's provenance, the photographic evidence's relationship to the clearance records, and the specific way those three elements corroborated the structure that Paragon's internal records and Hartwick's proffer were now expanding from the other direction. When she finished, the paralegal said, "Thank you, Ms. Carr." And there was a quality to how she said it, not perfunctory, something with more weight under it, that Emily noted and didn't comment on. Finch ended the call. "That's everything they need for tonight," she said. "The rest follows in the morning." The morning. Emily looked at the wall clock. It was 2:47. The morning was not far away in the literal sense, and in every other sense it felt like something belonging to a different chapter of a story that had been going on longer than most stories should. She left the conference room and went back to the south wing corridor and the chair outside Titan's recovery room, and she sat in it, and this time she did not check her phone or wait for the next thing or hold herself in the ready posture of someone anticipating a complication. She sat, and the hospital moved around her in its nighttime way, and somewhere beyond the recovery room door a dog's breathing was slow and even and no longer carrying the specific quality of something endured, and that, more than the warrant, more than the record correction, more than the memo in its evidence bag, was the thing she sat with. She slept in the chair, not intentionally and not well. The specific fractured sleep of someone in an upright institutional chair who is too tired to stay awake and too keyed up to go fully under. And she woke at 5:40 with a stiff neck and Hawkins sitting across the hall in the chair he'd occupied before, watching her with the expression of someone who has been awake and has decided not to disturb the first sleep they've seen another person get in hours. "You should have woken me," Emily said. "You needed it more than I needed to talk," he said. "Coffee's still in the break room. I checked 15 minutes ago." She got up. Her body registered its complaints in the specific order of a person who had been moving on adrenaline and was now receiving the invoice. She got coffee. It was slightly less bad than it had been at 2 in the morning, which meant it was merely bad rather than terrible, and she drank half of it standing in the break room doorway before she checked her phone. 3 texts from Hollowell. The first at 3:20, CID arrived Fort Burnham. Access granted. The second at 4:05, Pruitt in custody. No resistance. Installation secured. The third at 5:15, which was the one Emily read twice. Full charging document filed this morning. Eastern District of Georgia and District of Montana jointly. Vass, Hartwick, Pruitt, and 2 Veridine Paragon executives. Press release going out at 7 a.m. Eastern. Recommend you prepare for media contact. She stared at that last sentence for a moment. She had not, in 14 years of maintaining documents and building a case, and living in the specific discipline of someone who cannot afford to think too far ahead, prepared herself for the part where it became public. The part where her name appeared in a federal press release in connection with a military corruption case involving a sitting 2-star general. She had thought about the outcome. She had not thought carefully enough about what the outcome looked like from the outside. She texted Nadi, 7 a.m. federal press release. I need you. The response came in 40 seconds. Already on it. Don't speak to any media without me present. Eat something. Emily almost smiled. It was the most Nadi thing possible to say, and the fact that it was exactly right, that she genuinely had not eaten since noon the previous day, was both annoying and clarifying. She found crackers in the break room cabinet and ate them standing at the window, watching the Montana sky do what it does in the hour before dawn, which is go through a sequence of colors that has no equivalent anywhere else, and that Emily had spent 2 years watching from various windows of this hospital without ever quite getting used to it. The flatland east of Harlow Falls was still dark, but the dark was changing at its edges, and the mountains to the west held the last of the night in their upper elevations, while the lower ground began to take on definition. She had chosen this place deliberately. She had not chosen it for the sky, which she hadn't known about until she arrived. That was one of the things you couldn't plan for. The specific, unexpected things a place gave you that turned out to matter. At 6:30, Hollowell found her. She came into the break room without ceremony and poured herself coffee and stood beside Emily at the window, and they both looked at the sky for a moment before either of them spoke. "Pruitt is talking," Hollowell said. He lawyered up immediately, but his attorney apparently advised cooperation, which means his attorney has read the evidence and done the math. She drank coffee. "He's confirming Hartwick's account. He's adding detail about the financial structure that fills gaps we've had for months." "How many years?" "The arrangement with Veridine started 17 years ago, 2 years before Iron Shield officially launched." Hollowell paused. Iron Shield was built around the financial arrangement, not the other way around. The rehabilitation program was cover for a contract structure that was already in place. Emily absorbed that. 17 years. The program she had joined as a 22-year-old specialist, believing she was doing rehabilitative work that mattered, had been a financial mechanism from before she arrived. The dogs, the handlers, the care, all of it had been peripheral to a payment structure between a retired general and a defense contractor. The dogs weren't incidental, she said. It wasn't a question. She was working through the shape of something. Using real dogs, real handlers, real medical processes. That's what made the clearance fraud credible. You can't fake the mechanism if the mechanism isn't real. That's what the prosecutors are arguing, Hollowell said. The program had to function, at least partly, to generate the documentation that justified the clearance payments, which means people like you, people who genuinely believed in the work, were necessary to the fraud. You couldn't run it with everyone knowing. That sat in Emily's chest in a specific and uncomfortable way. She had been useful to the thing she'd exposed in the period before she'd exposed it. That was not guilt. The distinction between being deceived and being complicit was clear and absolute. But it was also not nothing. It was the particular human texture of having been part of a system before understanding what the system was. The dogs that were redeployed fraudulently, Emily said. The 43. 47, as of Pruitt's admission this morning. He added 4 that weren't in our original count. Handlers are being notified? The notification process starts today. A dedicated team from the Army's Casualty and Welfare Office has been assembled. They'll contact each handler individually. Hollowell put her cup down. Some of those handlers are going to be angry, appropriately. Some of them have been told for years that their dog's deterioration was natural service wear. Finding out it was preventable and prevented from being prevented by people in their own chain of command, she stopped. It's going to be a long process. I know, Emily said. It was a long process for me too. At 7:15, the federal press release went public. Emily was in the south wing with Nadi when Nadi's phone began making the specific sound of a communications professional whose inbox has just received a significant volume of the same type of message simultaneously. Nadi looked at it, made a sound of controlled professional acknowledgement, and turned the phone face down. "The headline is going to be this general," Nadi said. "Sitting two-star in military custody. That's the story the media grabs." "Good," Emily said. "Your name is in the release, as the originating whistleblower and material witness." Nadi looked at her. "There will be requests." "I'm not doing interviews today." "You're not doing interviews today," Nadi agreed. "Or this week, without preparation. But eventually, you'll want to. Not for the media, for the handlers. They're going to want to know who did this and why it took so long and what it means going forward, and that's a conversation worth having on your own terms." Emily thought about that. She thought about what she would say to a handler who had filed reports for months about their dog's deterioration and been told they were the problem. She knew what she would say because she had been that person, and the thing that had mattered most to her in those years, the thing she had needed most and received from almost no one, was not reassurance and not apology, and not the institutional language of remediation. It was someone telling her plainly that she had been right, that the thing she saw was real, and that her refusal to stop seeing it had mattered. That was sayable. She would say it. At 9 in the morning, Dr. Grasso completed Titan's first full post-operative assessment. Emily was present and Hawkins was present, and they stood on opposite sides of the recovery surface, while Grasso worked with methodical thoroughness through the protocol. Titan was alert now in a way he hadn't been the previous night. The anesthesia fully metabolized, the specific fog of it gone, and he tracked movement and sound with the responsive attention of an animal whose mind had never been injured even when his body had been. And that was the thing about dogs like him that Emily had always found both remarkable and painful. The cognitive presence remained fully intact while the physical damage accumulated unacknowledged beneath it. "Pain response is within normal post-op range," Grasso said, making notes. "Weight-bearing is going to be weeks away. The stabilization. Hardware will need a follow-up assessment at 6 weeks, and I want imaging at 12 weeks to check the bone remodeling." She looked up. "The prognosis for full mobility, with the right rehabilitation protocol and timeline, is good, not certain. Orthopedic cases like this have variables that don't resolve until they resolve, but I'm not seeing indicators that should make us pessimistic." Hawkins said, "What does rehabilitation look like?" "Structured, progressive. It needs a facility with veterinary rehab capability and ideally someone with specific canine experience." Grasso paused. "There's a program at a veterinary hospital in Colorado, Ridgecrest Animal Medical Center, that I'd recommend. They have the equipment and the staff background. It's a 4 to 6 month commitment." "I'll make it work," Hawkins said, without hesitation. Grasso looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone assessing commitment and finding it genuine. "I know you will," she said simply, and went back to her notes. Emily put her hand on Titan's head, gently, just resting it there, and the dog turned and pressed his nose briefly against her wrist. The same gesture as the first time. The recognition in it was not mysterious to Emily now, in the way it had seemed to everyone else in the intake bay the previous day. It was just what it was, an animal that had been trained in the specific environment where she had worked, that carried in its neurological architecture the particular pattern of interactions from that period, recognizing something in her hands and her stillness, and the way she moved that matched a template laid down years before either of them had imagined ending up in a hospital in Montana. "Hey," Hawkins said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. And he said it the way people say things they mean when they've already considered whether to say them and decided. Not quickly, not easily, but with the weight of having thought about it. Not just for the imaging, for last night, all of it. "You got him here," Emily said. "That was you." "I got him here and every doctor told me to turn around." He looked at Titan. "You didn't." "No," she said. "I didn't." They left it there. Some things don't need more words than they've already been given. The hospital day shift started at 7, and by 9 the corridors had the normal volume of a functioning medical facility, which after the particular intensity of the night felt both ordinary and slightly unreal. Emily went to the nursing station at 9:30 to submit her documentation from the previous shift. She had been technically on shift for some portion of the previous evening, and the documentation still needed to happen regardless of what else had happened. And she was standing at the terminal working through it when she became aware that the station had gone quieter than usual. She looked up. Dr. Vanessa Pryor was standing at the edge of the nursing station with several members of the day shift staff around her, and she had the specific posture of someone who has prepared something and is in the process of deciding whether to deliver it. When she saw that Emily had looked up, she came forward. "I owe you something," Pryor said. She said it in the register of the station, not privately, not publicly, but in the normal volume of a workplace conversation that happened to have an audience. "I've been reviewing your employment record here, your shift documentation, the incident logs from the past 2 years. I've also now had a full briefing from Agent Hollowell on what you've been involved with and what your background actually is." She paused. "I should have asked more questions when you arrived here. I formed a judgment and I held it without revisiting it, and that was poor practice." Emily said nothing. She waited. "I'd like to talk to you about your role here going forward," Pryor said. "Not today. When you've had rest and this has settled somewhat. But I want you to know that the conversation I want to have is not about whether you continue here. It's about what you do here, and whether what we've been utilizing you for is the right use of what you actually have." Patrice Weld was at the far end of the station. She was looking at a chart. She was very deliberately looking at a chart. Emily noticed this and found it, unexpectedly, almost kind. The specific mercy of someone who has been unkind deciding that the least they can do now is get out of the way. "I appreciate that," Emily said to Pryor. "I'll be in sometime next week." She turned back to the terminal and finished her documentation. She drove home at 10:15 in the morning. The Range Rover was gone from the end of her road. The house was exactly as she'd left it when she and Castellano had gone out the back. Dishes in the drying rack, book face down on the table, running shoes by the door. She moved the bed back into position over the empty space where the lockbox had been, and the open space looked different than she expected. Not wrong, just different, like a place where something heavy had been stored for a long time and the floor beneath it turned out to be fine. She showered. She actually ate, eggs and toast and the end of a container of orange juice. And she sat at her kitchen table with the second folder Finch had given her the previous night, the one she hadn't opened, the one with the letter from the Secretary of the Army's office. She opened it. The letter was formal and official and signed by a name above a title that represented an institutional authority she had spent 14 years fighting to be heard by. Its language was the careful, measured language of institutions, acknowledging error, the subjunctive constructions, the passive constructions, the phrases that communicated accountability without quite using the word fault, which was standard and expected and also beside the point. But at the bottom of the letter, below the signature block, was a handwritten addition, 2 lines, in a different pen. She read them, and the handwriting was not the handwriting of someone who had been told to add something. It was too uneven, too hurried, the mark of someone who had read the typed letter and found it insufficient and picked up a pen. It said, "What you did required a kind of courage we failed to deserve. I'm sorry it took this long." Emily sat with that for a while. She had been waiting. In some part of herself she'd kept carefully separate from her operational thinking for something like this. Not the letter specifically. She had never quite allowed herself to imagine the letter. But the acknowledgement beneath the letter. The human sentence beneath the institutional one. The admission that there had been a person on the other side of the machinery, and that the person had been wronged, and that the wrongness was not a bureaucratic error but a human one. She folded the letter and put it back in the folder. She did not put the folder under the floorboard. There was nothing under the floorboard now except the original boards of a house someone had built in 1987. She put the folder on her bookshelf, between 2 books she'd read 3 times each, in the place where things go that you want to be able to see. The following weeks moved in the specific way of aftermath, not slowly, not quickly, but with the texture of things working themselves out according to their own internal timelines. The federal charging document for Vass, Hartwick, Pruitt, and the 2 Paragon executives became public record on the second day and generated the kind of media coverage that Emily had expected and Nadi had prepared her for. The headline was always Pruitt, sitting 2-star general, military corruption, 17 years. And Emily's name appeared in the coverage as the whistleblower who had preserved the originating documentation, which was accurate and impersonal in the way that journalism about people you know yourself to be is always impersonal. She gave one interview. She chose the outlet carefully, with Nadi's input, and she chose it specifically because they had covered military working dog welfare before and had an audience that included handlers. She said what she'd told herself she would say, that the thing that mattered was not the years she'd spent building the case, but the years the dogs and their handlers had spent in a system that had decided their reports were the problem. She said that the hardest part of whistleblowing is not the institutions you fight. Institutions are structures, and structures can be changed, but the specific human experience of being told, repeatedly and by people with authority, that what you can clearly see is not there. She said that the question she'd asked herself most often in the years between filing her original report and the night in Harlow Falls was not whether she was right, but whether being right was going to be enough. And that the answer she'd arrived at, which she held on to through all of it, was that being right only mattered if you did something with it. That a correct observation preserved in silence is just a grievance, but a correct observation preserved in documentation, maintained over time with patience and precision, becomes evidence. The interviewer asked if she was angry. Emily thought about that. She thought about Titan in the intake bay, pressing his nose into her hand. About Darapel pressing a single page of a budget document into her hand in a parking lot. About 14 years of a floorboard and a lockbox and a small notebook in her locker, and the particular discipline of someone who cannot afford to let their anger be larger than their patience. I was, she said, for a long time. The anger was useful. It was the reason I kept the files. But anger as a sustained operating state is expensive. It costs more than most people can pay indefinitely. She paused. At some point, I had to shift from being angry about what they took from me to being focused on what I was going to do with what I still had. That's not a comfortable shift to make, but it's the only one that gets you somewhere. Raymond Vass pleaded not guilty at his arraignment and maintained that position for 6 weeks before his attorney negotiated a plea on 3 of the 7 charges that had been filed. The plea included full cooperation with prosecutors, which, under the terms Nadi reviewed carefully and explained to Emily in detail, meant that Vass's cooperation became part of the evidentiary record that the prosecution could use to strengthen the case against Pruitt specifically. Hartwick's cooperation had been so extensive that his sentencing agreement included credit for the records he'd preserved, the Fort Delacroix internal documents that Hollowell's team had spent years trying to locate, and that Hartwick had stored, with what Emily suspected was its own version of self-preservation logic, in a private facility under a name that wasn't his. The credit was not a pass. He received a sentence, but the judge's public statement at sentencing noted that the records Hartwick provided had been essential to establishing the full scope of the conspiracy, and that without them, several of the charges against Pruitt would have been significantly harder to prove. Major General Wallace Pruitt went to trial. He was the only one who did. The trial lasted 16 days and received national coverage, and Emily testified on the 4th day for 3 hours, which was the most she had ever spoken about Iron Shield in a single continuous period, and she did it sitting in a federal courtroom in Georgia in the specific formal attire she'd bought with Nadi's help. Not because she cared about the attire, but because Nadi had explained with her particular direct patience that the way a witness presents affects how testimony is received, and Emily had filed that away as a tactical fact rather than a personal concession. She testified to the documents, to what she had observed, to the specific chronology of what she had reported, to whom, and what had happened to the report. The defense attorney's cross-examination lasted 90 minutes and was structured around the argument that her documentation was incomplete, that her interpretation of the financial records was speculative, and that her professional credibility had been compromised by the nature of her military discharge, which was where Nadi, sitting in the gallery, visibly straightened, because that line of questioning opened the door for the prosecution to introduce the record correction and the full documented history of how Emily's discharge classification had been falsified, which the defense attorney had apparently not modeled as a likely outcome. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Emily was not in Georgia for the verdict. She was in Harlow Falls, working a day shift. She found out from Nadi's text message at 2:14 in the afternoon, a single line, because Nadi used words with the same economy she used everything, guilty on all counts. Emily read it standing in the medication prep room. She put her phone in her pocket. She finished what she was doing. She washed her hands, which she would have done regardless. Then she went into the break room, poured herself water because the coffee was consistently bad, and she had given up on it, and she sat down for 4 minutes before her next patient round. She sat in the specific way of someone who has just received news that resolves the last piece of a structure they have been maintaining for so long that the structure has become part of how they understand themselves. And the question of who they are without the weight of it is both a relief and something that requires thought. She allowed herself those 4 minutes. Then she went back to work. Titan's rehabilitation at Ridgecrest Animal Medical Center in Colorado took 5.5 months. Hawkins sent Emily updates, not regularly, but occasionally, in the form of photos and brief messages that had the tone of someone reporting to a person they considered part of the process. The first photo was Titan in a hydrotherapy pool with the specific expression of a dog who has decided to tolerate something undignified for reasons he doesn't yet understand. The third photo was Titan walking, actually walking, unassisted, on a level surface, with the slightly asymmetric gait that Grasso had said was the most realistic expectation given the fracture's progression. The fifth photo, sent without a message, was Titan on a couch in what Emily recognized as a living room. A specific couch, well worn, the couch of someone who had furnished their house for utility rather than appearance, lying on his side in the full, unconditional relaxation of an animal that is not in pain and knows it is home. She saved that photo. She saved it not in any deliberate or ceremonial way. She just didn't delete it, which is the real way anyone keeps something that matters. 3 months after this verdict, Hollowell called. "I have something to ask you," Hollowell said, "and I want to say up front that the answer no is completely acceptable and won't affect anything." "Ask," Emily said. "DCIS and the Army IG are jointly standing up a review process for all military working dog medical clearance records going back 20 years. Not just Iron Shield, everything. Looking for patterns, documentation irregularities, cases that need re-examination." A pause. "We need someone who has deep knowledge of what proper canine medical assessment looks like, who understands the specific ways the clearance process can be manipulated, and who has credibility with both the veteran handler community and the investigative community." Another pause. "I thought of you." Emily was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the Montana sky was doing what it always did. The particular depth of it, the way weather moved through it, with the transparency of a place that doesn't have enough obstructions to slow things down. "What does it look like?" she said. "Structurally. Consulting capacity. You keep your life here. Travel when needed. You'd be working with a small team, veterinary, legal, investigative." Hollowell paused. "We'd want your knowledge, your eye, and your way of seeing things that other people with the same facts in front of them consistently miss." Emily thought about the intake bay, about Titan walking through the emergency doors, about the specific way a working dog moves when it's been carrying pain for long enough that the pain has become part of how it moves, about the 47 dogs and the handlers who had filed reports and been told they were the problem. "Yes," she said, "I'll do it." She kept the job at Crestview. She negotiated the terms with Pryor directly, without intermediary, in a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and resulted in a modified role that formalized what Emily had actually been doing for 2 years. Trauma assessment, complex diagnostic consultation, the specific work of noticing things that the standard protocols missed. Pryor drove the hardest bargain she could drive and accepted the terms Emily held on, and the conversation ended with both of them knowing that the dynamic between them had been renegotiated at a fundamental level, which was not comfortable for either of them, and was the right outcome regardless. On a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months and 4 days after Titan had come through the emergency doors, a car pulled into the Crestview Valley Medical Center parking lot, and Dale Hawkins got out and opened the rear door, and Titan stepped down from the back seat onto the Montana asphalt with the asymmetric but functional gait of an animal that had been through a significant thing and had come out the other side of it. Emily was on her break. She saw them from the window of the break room, the same window where she'd watched the sky change, where she'd eaten crackers at 2 in the morning while the investigation was expanding beyond its original container. And she set down her coffee and went outside. Hawkins looked better than she'd seen him. Not fixed, exactly. There was still something in the set of his shoulders that would probably always be there, the particular permanent tension of a person who has been managing a crisis for too long, but lighter. the specific lightness of a weight distributed more bearably. Titan saw her from 30 feet away and moved toward her with the focused intention of an animal that has decided something, and Hawkins gave him the leash length he needed, and the dog came to her and stood in front of her and pressed his nose against the back of her hand exactly as he had the first time, in the emergency bay, with every doctor in the room staring and not understanding what they were seeing. She crouched down to his level. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention that animals have when they are not performing anything for anyone, not working, not reacting, just present, just looking at the specific person in front of them with all of themselves available to do it. "Hey," she said, quietly. He put his head under her hand. She held it there for a moment, in the November cold, in the parking lot of a hospital in a small Montana town, and she thought about what it had cost. The 14 years of precision and patience, the small house and the lockbox and the floorboard, the invisible labor of maintaining a truth that the people with power had decided was inconvenient, and she thought about what it had accomplished, not in the abstract but specifically. The 47 dogs and the correction of 47 fraudulent clearances. The handlers who now knew the truth about what had happened to their partners. The program that would never again be used as cover for the kind of arrangement that had run undetected for 17 years. And she thought, because she was a person, not a symbol, and people's thoughts are specific and imperfect and sometimes smaller than the moments they occur in, about Dara Pell, who had pressed one page of a document into her hand and disappeared to Germany, and whether she had ever found out what it became. Emily had tried twice to locate her and hadn't managed it. She might someday. Or she might not, and Pell might go on never knowing that the page she'd handed over had been the piece that corroborated everything else, had been the foundation of an evidentiary chain that had put a 2-star general in federal custody. Sometimes people did essential things and never found out what the things became. That was its own kind of truth worth holding. Hawkins came and stood beside her. They were both looking at the dog. "He wanted to come back here," Hawkins said. "I mean, I don't know if dogs want things the way we do, but when I drove into Harlow Falls this morning, he sat up, recognized something." He paused. "I think it was the smell, or the direction, or just, he knew where we were going." "He probably did," Emily said. "You saved him." She'd been waiting for that sentence. She'd thought about how to answer it. "I identified the injury," she said. "You drove him here. Grasso operated. You paid for 5 months of rehabilitation." She looked at the dog. "He did the work?" Hawkins was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a very inconvenient answer." "Yes," Emily said. "It is." She stood up. The cold came off the flatland in the way of November in Montana, which was significant and uncomplicated about its intentions, and Titan pressed briefly against her leg before turning back to Hawkins, which was also exactly right. He was where he belonged, and he knew it, and his coming here had been the particular grace of a creature choosing to return to the place where something true had happened. Emily put her hands in her jacket pockets and looked at the two of them, the dog and the man who had driven 900 miles with him in the back seat to a hospital in a town the size of a postage stamp, because he had believed what he could see even when every authority told him he was wrong. And she thought about what she would say in the next interview she gave, which Nadi had already scheduled for February, in front of a larger audience than she'd spoken to before. She would say this, that the most dangerous thing a system can do to a person who has seen something true is to make them doubt what they saw. Not to disprove it. Disproof is an argument, and arguments can be countered. To make them doubt. To accumulate enough institutional dismissal and professional consequence that the person begins to ask themselves, in the private hours, whether the thing they saw was really there. That is the mechanism. That is what the machinery is actually doing when it calls you overprotective, stress-impaired, out of lane, just a nurse, just a specialist, just someone who didn't understand the complexity of a program that powerful people needed to stay unexamined. And she would say, the answer is to write it down. Not because writing it down makes it real. It's already real. You already saw it. But because writing it down means that the truth exists somewhere that is not only inside you, which is a safer place for truth to be when the people around you have decided that your perception is a problem to be managed rather than a report to be investigated. She would say, keep the documentation, keep the photographs, keep the dates. Not out of anger. Anger is expensive and has a short operational life. but out of the specific, unglamorous, entirely unsexy discipline of a person who has decided that what they know matters and is going to behave accordingly, regardless of how long the accordingly takes. She would say, I was a specialist, and then I was a civilian nurse, and then I was the woman everyone ignored, and then I was the government's most important witness, and then I was the person who watched a two-star general get convicted in a federal court in Georgia on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working a day shift in Montana. And none of those things canceled each other out. They were all simultaneously true. The being ignored and the mattering were not opposites. They were the same story told from different points in time. And finally, because she was not built for false comfort and had never offered it and was not going to start, she would say, it is not always going to work out. The documentation doesn't always reach the right people. The right people don't always act on it. There are versions of this story where the floorboard stays closed and the memo stays buried, and the 47 become 48 and then more. Those versions exist. She had spent 14 years inside the possibility of those versions. But she would also say, the version where it works requires someone who decides to keep going past the point where a reasonable person would have stopped. And that is a choice. It is not a natural disposition or a special quality or something you either have or don't. It is a decision, made again and again, in the ordinary circumstances of ordinary days, to maintain the file and reread the memo and trust the thing you saw. That is all it is. That is all it ever was. Titan sat down in the parking lot and looked up at her. She looked back at him. The asymmetric stance, the healed fracture, the yellow eyes that had recognized her from across a room full of panic on a Wednesday afternoon, and walked toward her with the complete, uncalculating trust of an animal that simply knew what it knew. She had been invisible for a long time, and then she had not been. And the distance between those two things was 14 years of a lockbox under a floorboard and one dog who pressed his nose into her hand and let everyone in the room see what he saw. Sometimes the truth finds its way out, because someone fights for it loudly, visibly, at great cost to themselves in public, and that kind of courage deserves every word written about it. And sometimes it finds its way out because one person, in a quiet house, in a small town, keeps a file. Both matter. The second one is harder than it looks. Emily Carr went back inside and finished her shift.